Yeah, so the choir, yeah, I was just very lucky to get to spend time with them. That was kind of an ongoing project that was happening anyway. The other things that were collaborations were more things that I prompted or invited, but that was a thing that was happening. So they are the Mid-Columbia Master Singers. They're an all-volunteer choir, and they're all local, and they feel like you really feel when they're performing that actually many of them have a relationship with the site. Some of them work out on the site doing cleanup. Some of them are multi-generation Hanford families. So there's a lot of personal relationship with the site. And then the kind of way this particular piece came about is kind of a crazy story. But the lyrics for this oratorio opera, I always call it an opera, but I think it's an oratorio because there's no costumes. But it's this woman who worked out on the site for 35 years as an environmental engineer and became progressively more haunted by her work at Hanford and everything that she saw, to the point where she decided to get a degree in Jungian psychology kind of late in life. And then for her master's thesis project in this degree program, she began collecting and making an archive of anxiety dreams of her colleagues at Hanford. So she amassed this kind of giant anxiety dream archive of Hanford workers. And then her neighbor happens to be a composer, and she was telling her neighbor about this weird archive, and he was like, let's make an opera. So that's kind of how that happened. And they had done a couple of times, the artistic director. They're kind of really visionary and interesting artists, all of them. But the artistic director had for a while had this idea to do performances in the B reactor, which is the reactor that made the Nagasaki bomb plutonium, the historic reactor. And I think worked quite hard to convince the Department of Energy to let him do this. So those are kind of all the different pieces. And that performance was around the 76th anniversary of the reactor. Yeah, that's the whole, yeah. Yeah, but they're just amazing, it's amazing, yeah. And very moving to hear that in this space, yeah.
Maybe then I'll just go back to some basics and ask you how you came to make this film and how you got interested in Hanford and Richland.
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about Hanford or Richland, which I found is true all over the US. I think people in the Pacific Northwest have tended to know something about Hanford when they've shown the film, but most people in most of the country don't, and it's kind of this kind of most hidden part of the Manhattan Project, despite being the biggest site physically of the Manhattan Project. So yeah, I didn't know anything about it, but almost all my work, I think, is work that's thinking about community memory in different ways. I'm often kind of drawn to thinking about spaces where there's something unprocessed or still being negotiated about a history in the present tense, and I think all of my work kind of gravitates towards those kinds of spaces. So I was in Richland for about 24 hours in 2015 while I was shooting my previous film, which showed here in 2018, which had nothing to do with Hanford or Richland, but was a film where I was traveling all over the US and doing these kind of road trips and filming in a lot of different places. So I was there for a day, and then as you see in the film, there's like mushroom clouds all over the town. So I was like, what is this place? And I think, initially I was just curious and wanted to learn more, but I think then quickly kind of felt, because this is the stuff I think about, that there's something really significant about the way that this community has processed or not processed or is living alongside their history, and I think that's what kind of made me interested to keep spending time. And then as well in 2015, when I first went to Richland, that was, of course, the first Trump election was kind of beginning. And I think also in that moment, I was feeling really compelled, or even I think felt it was an urgent political project to think about ways of making really generous listening space with people with whom I felt political difference. So that was, I think, the other impulse was to just think about spending time in a community that was very conservative, but to think about how to do that ethically and generously and what that might do.
So given that you didn't have a prior relationship in the town, how did you approach people and get them to participate?
Yeah, so this was a 4.5-year film, so I did that slowly. But I think people were pretty open, interestingly, because it's a community that I think is pretty suspicious of outsider projects, and also I think has been portrayed judgmentally often by especially investigative journalists who come into Hanford and kind of make exposés about how bad things are and go home and don't spend a lot of time. But I think people felt reassured, and I would tell people as I was meeting them kind of how I work, that I was planning to, that I make work that takes a long time, that I was planning to spend a lot of time, that I'm not a journalist, that I'm not making an investigative piece, that I'm not making an anti-nuclear film was important for people, and I don't think, I think the film has a critical perspective about nuclear weapons, but it's not like an activist film with a position around nuclear industry, and I think all of those things made people more open. But also I think I was listening to people and then also really like building a network of relationships over a long time. And people would introduce me to other people.
The Japanese artist is such an important presence in the film, and I'm wondering how you involved her and how she came to make this project there.
Yeah, so Yuki, I knew from the beginning of the film that it would be really important to include a Japanese perspective and voice in the film, and then I felt kind of confused for a while about how to do that, because also the method of the film is really that it's a place-based film, so it never felt, it would have been really outside of the kind of grammar and process of the film to like go to Japan and talk to people for the film, or film in Seattle where there's a bigger Japanese community. So I had to really, just kind of patiently wait for the right moment to figure out how to do that. And then I had been tracking, I knew that the national parks, so there's a national park, that's the Manhattan Project National Park, that's this kind of three-site park. It's Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford. And I knew that they were planning to do this kind of commemoration ceremony, which you see in the film, which is actually, it took 76 years for any kind of like official remembrance of the Nagasaki bombing to happen. So that thing with like 5 people was the first time it was done in the community. But I knew that they were planning it, and I kept thinking like, oh, this will be a moment when they like engage, like Japanese people will come, or they'll do some kind of outreach. And like I kept asking, I was like, will there be Japanese people coming? And at a certain point it seemed clear that like they hadn't done that. And they have a complicated job actually, where they're embedded in these very conservative communities, and their job is to make new interpretive history, but within these communities where there's like a lot of resistance to that. Then I was like, well, I'll invite a Japanese person. So Yuki is someone I had met. She's very involved with nuclear activism, and I had met her through a kind of Hanford-related listening session on Zoom, and had started to email her and knew about her art and her art practice, and actually just got to know her as like an artist and peer, and then had this idea to involve her in that commemoration ceremony and invite her to come and then collaborate with me. Yeah.
I have like 30 more questions, but I also want to open it up to you all here. Yeah.
Yeah.
At what point did that get involved in
Yeah, the book of poems. So it's all from one book. The book is called Plume by Kathleen Flanagan. She's born and raised in Richland and also worked at Hanford as a young woman and is now a poet living in Seattle. And she had written this book, Plume, that I think I found very early in my research. And when I found it, so the whole book is really about her really like holding and grappling with this contradiction of kind of loving her childhood and feeling really nostalgic about her childhood, and then also really reckoning as an adult with everything she later learned about Hanford. And so it's a very affective nuclear feelings book. And I think like when I started to make the film, if you spend time in Richland, I don't know if is anyone here from Richland? Yeah, welcome. So there's a lot of scientists and engineers, and I don't know, a lot of them are men, and there's a lot of, people who want to talk to you about facts and information, like in a lot of detail, like how plutonium is made, how a reactor works. And I feel like I knew that I really was not super interested in that, but much more interested in kind of a more, affective nuclear feelings space. And when I found that book, it felt like kind of the first thing I read that really opened that portal up for me. So I reached out to Kathleen quite early before I even started shooting and asked her if she would be open to letting me use the book. And I think it kind of does that. I think if you film with someone and ask them to tell you about the history of their town or how a reactor works, something different happens than if you invite someone to read a poem and say how they feel. So she's been really involved with the film, and people know the book. People tend to pay attention in Richland because it's such a unique and specific community. I think when there's a book about Richland, a lot of people know it. So a lot of people had read it and kind of had a poem that they wanted to read. Yeah, I mean, it makes a kind of collective voice also, yeah. 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 How did I approach? It was mostly people who wanted to, because people don't want to talk about it in town. Yeah. Yeah. And then some people do want to talk about it, and it was so Carolyn, the woman at the end who talks about losing her dad, she's actually the childhood best friend of the poet. So she came into the film through Kathleen. And she's someone who had told her story before. She first told her story in the early 2000s. There was maybe you know this, there was a federal congressional hearing in Richland that was the first moment where a lot of Hanford workers kind of spoke up about getting sick. And she had spoken at that and then been actually quite ostracized and shunned by a lot of people in the community, and it had a really big impact on her. So I think she has a complicated relationship to what it means to tell her story, but I think she wanted to do it for this film, and I think she felt like it would be okay to do it in this context. Yeah, but a lot of people don't want to. But people don't want to talk about it, and then there's the women showing the alphabet houses who are and also my dad died of cancer. I mean, it's kind of often they're in the background in a kind of,
One statistic that I was someone who was a surgeon who moved from Chicago to the area to see more cancer cases here in Chicago.
Yeah, but it's very hard. What I learned, which I didn't know, I learned all this epidemiology stuff, but it's extremely hard to pin down in a population-wide study. Something, especially like cancer, that has a very long latency period where you can be exposed and then 10 years later you get cancer, and then meanwhile you've been exposed to a million other things that also cause cancer, as we all are all the time, which is part of why the Downwinder toxic tort litigation took 24 years and was so inconclusive, because it's extremely hard to just pin that down with statistical certainty. So it's anecdotally, many people have experienced that there's a lot of cancer, but it's hard to prove that in a court. Yeah.
So I know, first of all, thank you. This was a great film, but
Thank you.
I know it's a totally different film than Oppenheimer.
Yes.
The thing that really bothered me about that film was they did not show what it did in Hiroshima. And so I appreciated that you have a man working who talked about people who came from Japan and they were trying to find closure and there was no closure. But did you think about going to Nagasaki at all?
Not for the film. So I just came back from Japan, and the film is showing in Japan right now. It's in 26 cities. It's in a wide national release, and that's been incredibly amazing. And it's something I really hoped would happen with the film. So I didn't get to go to Nagasaki. It's opening in Nagasaki on the bombing anniversary, but I did do a screening and a preview in Hiroshima, and that was pretty amazing. And actually, one of the most interesting audience comments was a guy who is a volunteer at the Peace Park in Hiroshima, who's around the same age as that museum docent, who was I really relate to this feeling where people come to this park, and I also don't know what is the closure that I can offer them. So, Yeah, but I didn't want to film there because it's really a place-based film about Richland. Yeah.
Are people who are living there now concerned about the potential toxicity that still remains?
Are people living there now concerned about toxicity? You know, it depends. So a lot of people still work on this site, and that's like a very active industry. So lots of people work there in cleanup, and for those people, it really depends what type of work they do, whether they have exposure. Some workers do get exposed and get sick, and other kind of people more on the science and engineering side maybe don't have a lot of exposure. Within the actual town, it's quite heavily monitored, so there's like soil and water and air monitoring that happens all the time, done by the Washington Department of Health, and they say it's fine, and they swim in the river, and it's okay. But you know, it's like danger and risk, I think, are two different, like something could happen, and then the town is close. But in an everyday sense, like the real kind of community illness that happened was mostly in the 40s and 50s when there was very, very large-scale emissions that came out of Hanford stacks into the air, and stuff was dumped into the river. And a lot of those radionuclides, like radioiodine, have a short half-life of like just a few weeks, so that stuff is gone. And then plutonium, of course, has a very long half-life, but it's very heavy, so it's not like flying everywhere in the air. So yeah, I think Richland is not like dangerous to be in an immediate way, but there's a risk because it's so close. But parts of Hanford are extremely toxic, yeah. And people who work in the tank farms where waste is stored, that's like potentially dangerous work. Sorry.
It's the first time. It's great help. Thank you for being here. It's great to see both of you. And it's the first time I've seen it, and I had a sense of a very close-knit community that had a lot invested in getting along, continuing to get along. And I sensed that I wasn't seeing a character. I don't have a sense of how big the community is, what the population is, but I did feel like I was seeing people that I recognized in different shots at different times. And so I guess I'm thinking, and I'm knowing how you work and knowing how much time you spent there and the relationships that were built and the word of mouth. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the life after the film and the response in the community and what the film's half-life itself there and impact back on its subject might be.
Yeah, so I brought it to Richland. That it was very scary, but it felt very important to not only show it, but to go back with it and to facilitate the discussion that happened. So it showed in October in the kind of community screening in that, where the donut shop is, in that same uptown, kind of central, yeah, in the uptown. And yeah, a lot of people came. It was very scary, even though I have like friends there, and the person who did the Q&A with me was Anne, who reads the JFK poem, who's like, has been a librarian for decades and knows everyone, and she was like, there are a lot of people, I think, hoping and making sure that it would be okay. I think, the people who came to the screening, to some extent, it's a self-selected community of people who were open enough to go to the screening. I don't know, a few hundred people came, and people stayed for an hour afterwards and had a really, I think, pretty substantial and moving and interesting conversation. And I think, people, I think, overall were happy that the film felt complicated to them and not like an investigative piece that just shows how bad the town is. So I think it's been well received. And then the funny thing that happened after that community screening is a local multiplex they were like, so many people came that they were like, we're gonna book this film. So it showed in a bill with the Taylor Swift film for 3 weeks in this, like Eastern Washington multiplex. So yeah, so it's now, a lot of people have seen it because it showed for a while. How I ended up with the structure. So I edit myself. It was like a year and a half of editing. I don't know. I'm a subtractive editor. Like I just watch everything over and over again and make it smaller and smaller until it's the thing. That's the short answer. But I don't have a structure at the beginning at all. So I'm really just watching and watching and watching and cutting it down over a long time. Yeah, maybe that might be the whole answer.
Really curious, you were talking about one of your impulses to make a film relating to like desire to listen and desire to be present. And I'm very curious, and I know you haven't had a chance to be present for every screening and all of that sort of stuff, but whenever there is a film about a place that's not well known, I feel like, especially if there's a negative political history, there's a tendency in the audience to other the people on screen and to feel very distant and disconnected, and I'm not them, oh haha, look at them. And there's an interesting arc that I saw in the film of like movement towards empathy over time. And I'm curious where you look at that when you screen the film and like your relationship to the complexity of, you know, I'm from the US, we pay for the US military and industrial complex every time we make money here. You know, like it's all, there is not distance, actually. So I don't know if there's a question concisely stated. But
Yeah. I mean, I can say some things that respond to that. I mean, I would say one thing, like a lot of people see the film and a kind of first reaction is like, wow, what an exceptional town. And then I think the more people sit with the film and the more I talk to them after screenings, I think a thing that I really make a lot of effort to say to people at every screening is that, you know, Richland maybe is sort of an exceptional town, but actually all of us live with histories of violence, right? The whole US is like, we're all living on top of histories of slavery and genocide, and that was really present to mind when I started working on the film as well in 2019. So yeah, I think it's not so distant, right? I think we're all, all not looking at something, or there's something we're pushing away, or there's some kind of like violence inside of us, or that we inhabit, that we're kind of navigating, how much we let that in or how we hold that. And I think also, I think a lot about what you're saying around kind of what our proximity or distance is from someone we're spending time with on screen and how we're navigating that in real time. That kind of time you spend with people is all cut pretty long in the film, and I think that does a certain kind of work where we're doing this really messy work of like not knowing who we're talking to at the beginning, and then maybe feeling close to them, and maybe suddenly feeling very, not close to them, depending on, I don't know, like there's the retired teacher who talks about taking down the mushroom cloud, and then suddenly he's talking about Robert E. Lee and talking about, like, there's a kind of turn in that conversation where I think we're actually doing a lot of work to kind of constantly kind of renegotiate who we think he is, who we are, if we like him, if we don't like him, if we feel empathetic. And I feel like the film makes a lot of those kinds of spaces where it's a little messy. And I think for any kind of viewer, whatever your politics are, I think there's some point in the film where it's going to feel challenging in that way. And I feel like that it's in the space of that work that I think interesting things happen, where we're being really active in the way that we're not just othering someone on screen, but we're kind of in relationship. I'm gonna get my water.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I was thinking a lot in the film about different generations' relationship to nuclear weapons, and people who grew up during the Cold War, people who don't really know maybe what the Cold War was. And what the scene with the high school students is quite interesting, because they talk about the history of the mascot and the history of the town, but I wondered if you had any insights about kind of differences among generations you talked to with regard to nuclear weapons and nuclear power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always like the further you are from a history, the easier it is to just be distant. And I think there's something real about generational distance where, yeah, people my age, I'm turning 50, even though those people my age were not alive during World War II and weren't part of that work, I think there's a real impulse to be protective of, people are protective of their parents, people are protective of their grandparents, and I think, yeah, it's like more generational distance. I think there's just much, more willingness to just throw all of that away or just think about it in a really new way. But also, a lot of those kids aren't going to stay in Richland, and I think that's the other, it kind of looks like, all the kids are going to change things, but a lot of them are going to move to LA or wherever, Seattle. I think but it does take, I think, just generations to process. And also, people still work there. I mean, I think that's also, it's really the whole economy, the reason all the parks and schools and libraries look so nice is because there's billions of dollars of federal cleanup funding that kind of structure everything that happens in the community. So it's still very much a nuclear company town, even though production is over.
I just had one more question, which had to do with these different scales of time that you deal with in the film. I thought was really powerful, and maybe you could talk about the decision to work that way.
Yeah, I thought so much about that, about kind of deep time. I mean, of course, plutonium is this 24,000-year future that it's so hard to conceptualize. And then at the same time, like in Chernobyl and like in other nuclear places, there's this kind of big swath of buffer land around the site that's like kind of untouched by industry or farming because it was taken away and set aside really early. So there's a way where you really see and feel the kind of deep time of geological time, of indigenous time, and all of that I think feels very present out there. People talk about it a lot. There's, people digging mammoths up. So I think that was part of kind of just trying to frame this 24,000-year future was also just trying to really think backwards also about deep time. Yeah, thank you.